Hello class, this week we're going to be covering curves. This is one of my all-time favorite adjustment layers, but back when I was a student and computers were carved out of stone, it was my most confusing adjustment layer and I hated it quite a bit. It wasn't until later in my career that I did some research and found out how to predict what it's going to do and why it does what it does and exactly how incredibly useful it is. Until that point, it was just nonsense. And then later, it was just amazing. So let's first, if you haven't done it, let me show you what a curves is. Now, the old school way of doing it was to go up to image and then go down to adjustments and then choose curves. But this is a destructive edit, which means that everything that happens to it is permanent and basically ruins everything. And so back on this thing, I try to work with it and I couldn't figure out what the heck it was doing. I'd be like, I guess it just makes nuclear images. I guess that's it. And then I'd tell it okay, and the image was ruined, and I'd move on with my life. So much later on, I went back to it and I started researching how everything worked. And I found out that you actually really want to do it as an adjustment layer. And that's available in two locations. One is through the adjustments tab, and you'll find the curves icon. It's this little one that looks like an S curve on a grid. There's a reason for that. I'll talk about that a little while later. But I hate the adjustments palette. What's the point to that? Because you really want to have properties up so you can see what the adjustment layer is doing. And you can just get the adjustment layer by going down to the black-white icon, which is the create new fill or adjustment layer. Click on that thing and then go to curves. Boom. Now you've got the curves layer. So I don't know why they have that adjustment tab. It's been there for a while. I guess maybe so you don't have to have the layers palette open or something, but then you wouldn't know where your adjustment is. It's a mind boggler. If you know why, then great. But let me go ahead and show you real quick what you can do with curves, just so that you have an idea of what you're aiming towards. And I'll explain step by step what everything is and how it works and why it works and why it's so great. And I think a second one might be in order. And I'll explain all of this shortly. We're in the green area, maybe the pencil tool. Oh, not there. What we really want is that's why. This here. And just a touch. Only in that area. There we go. A little too much. There. All right. So before, after. So what's going on? What worked? What happened? What is all this? Well, first things first, we need to figure out what we're looking at, and then you'll know why I was doing what I was doing. So just a second, I've taken a screenshot of curves in advance so I can show you. And it is the horses that we were just looking at. I'm just going to make a new layer real quick so I can draw on it. Curves uses two things, the input and the output. And if we go back over here, you can see that if you were to click on a curves, heads up, if you have the property window open and you click on a mask, it brings up the mask controls. Same sort of thing that we saw, week 2? If you click on the actual curve icon, it'll bring up the curves. If we click on one of these, we can see input, output. What is it talking about? Well, they didn't label anything, and so that's a big issue. Basically, grab a brush here. This line right here is the input, and this gradient, this long little gradient, that's the input. This gradient right here, this one is the output. All right, so what does that mean? Well, what it means is this. We have this little line right here. I'm going to zoom in a little bit more. We have this line that goes across. So what's happening? Well, remember back, week 1, I showed just a quick gradient that was a black to white gradient. And I said, hey, this black to white gradient represents every possible luminosity value. In other words, if we were just working in black and white, you would have 255 steps of color color of luminosity, with white being the brightest and black being the darkest. And if we were to come in with our little tool here, we can see, sure enough, since our eyedropper tool, since these are identical in order to be black and white, if you have a variation between the red, green, and blue channels, you get color, as you'll remember from our discussion of color constancy or reading the Wikipedia article on color constancy, whichever one you decide to go through. I recommend the video. It's fun to watch old British things. If there's a variation in it, you get color, but there's no variation here. It's just black and white. And so you can see that all these go on. And sure enough, we start at 0, all the way down the line, all the way up to 255 to get white. And in the middle, eventually we get to pure gray, which is 128. Voila. So we have 256 steps of gray. That's every luminance value. So in other words, if the image we were looking at was not in fact in color, and we can do that very easily using another adjustment layer called black and white. I'm just going to leave this default for the moment. Then the curve suddenly will just adjust the luminosity rather than the luminosity in color. So let me go ahead and grab the curves again under the black-white adjustment icon. That's getting lighter, that's getting darker. So what's going on? Well, popping back over here for a second. This section right here, this line, is saying where things are mapped. In other words, if we were to go straight up from, sorry, I still have the gradient, straight up, using my brush tool here, straight up from this is about gray, right, on this bar, we'd hit this line, and then immediately we would go left. So you could see that it wasn't quite middle gray. This would be middle gray. So in other words, if we have a, I believe this is a 45-degree angle. It's been a while since I've done trig, but hopefully I haven't forgotten that. If we have a 45-degree angle here, then any change that we make, or any luminosity value, is mapped to the identical luminosity value. In other words, by default, if I were to reset this, and I'll talk about all those in a minute, if I were to reset this, by default, every one of these values goes to its own value, so nothing happens. Okay, so what's the point of that? Well, you've got to start at a neutral point. If you don't start at a neutral point, you apply a layer, boom, all kinds of insanity happens. So by default, all of these from the input bar at the bottom, boop, 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 all the way over here, and then boop, 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 going over to the left, it's just as it should be. Everything is normal. Now, this is step one as to why curves is badly designed. This should actually have the input on the left and the output on the bottom, because in America we read from left to right, top to bottom. Because it's the other way around, people tend to get confused right off the bat. So let's take a look at this then. If we were to just say grab this middle, in other words all these middle values, and pull up, why it's getting lighter. Well, this makes sense, because now we're going from, say, this middle gray value up, and now notice it's not mapping to middle gray anymore. It's mapping much lighter. It's mapping to about, what looks like 75% white. If we were to go the opposite, we get much darker. All right, now notice we're going to about, what would that be, 25% white if we're going from bottom to top. So we're making things darker and lighter. Now this is where the power of curves starts to come into play. Unlike with levels, where everything just happens as a global adjustment, in other words, if we were to bring in a levels adjustment layer using the black-white icon, all we have is our global adjustments, and we'd normally just kind of bring these in, maybe squish this a little bit so that we get some slightly better values. Maybe we'd locate something that's supposed to be perfectly gray and click on that to get the gray point where we want it. Maybe we'd even use our white and black icons in a vain attempt to get everything a little more color neutral, or in this case black and white, get a wider dynamic range. We'll talk about what dynamic range means later in the semester. You know, we start getting a pretty good attempt, but with curves, what we can do instead, and just throw this levels away. You know what? I'll just leave the eyeball off. With curves, what we can do instead is target specific tonal ranges. What does that mean? Well, for example, if all of this black area, this bottom 25%, those are our darks, right? That's a tonal range of dark values. This upper 25% And I'll talk about why I know it's 25% in a minute as well. Don't worry about that. These are our light values. This 50% block is essentially our mid-range, going from the darker mids to the lighter mids and the exact mids. So we can do the same thing that we could do in levels. In other words, we could bring in the black and white points, and we could adjust the center gray, but instead of doing that, we can open things up in some locations and not in others. So we could, for example, bring down in the upper mids and the lights, bring those down so that they become darker, and we could bring up the darks just a little bit and open those up. That's one thing we could do. Another thing we could do, if I were to reset this, is apply what's called an S-curve. We'll talk about what an S-curve is and why it's so great in just a minute. And in this case, because of how dark it is, we'll actually want more of a bump on there. And really play with those tonal ranges. I'm going essentially back to where I was. I think my first instinct was a good one. And you have to be careful. You can get posterizing effects very easily. We'll talk about that in a bit too. And so instead of just the levels, you can control and open things up in different areas. This becomes especially valuable when we start doing adjustments in color ranges. So let's say we were to turn this off and switch to color. You can see how this is kind of washed out. Well, we'd want to do adjustments beyond just the black and white. We want to do adjustments within the color. And that's perfectly possible within curves. So let me go ahead and bring this in. And I'll go ahead and go over. It looks like we've got a magenta cast, and we'll talk some more about this, but a quick refresher. Magenta is just the opposite of green. So if you add in just a little bit of green, it's the same thing as reducing magenta. And you can do it in different tonal areas. So if you feel as though you like the magenta in the stones up front, you can bring that back in. And if you don't like it up in the sky, you can bring them out by just adjusting them in and out, just like that. And I think that that's incredible. All right, so that's essentially what curves are doing. So curves are just allowing you to remap from one position to another. And you do that by literally drawing a curve. So if I were to draw a curve in there, suddenly the darks become much brighter. See how it's no longer going to this position. The brights, in this case, would become much darker. And so you get a very different result. We can see that right here if I were to reset it. I just like playing with this thing too. The brights become darker and the darks become lighter, and that leads to a washed out image. So I'm going to tell you something right now. When you're picking your photo or taking your photo for this particular assignment, do watch out. Problem that I see a lot of students have is that they'll pick a photo that already looks amazing. So there's not as much to do on it, which means there's not as much for me to grade. And if they make a little mistake because they didn't have a lot that they did, it suddenly balloons up to a big mistake. So it's better to have something like one of these where it's really a washed out photo in one way or another. It's too dark or it's too light or it's black. There's maybe a color cast on it. Something's wrong. Something's clearly wrong. You can find out quickly whether or not it's a good candidate by using the auto levels. So remember, you've got image adjustment levels, and underneath that you have the auto option. You can also do that with Control Shift and L on your keyboard. If you notice a drastic improvement by doing Control Shift L, it's a good candidate. Now, I think we can do even better with curves than with auto levels, so that's fine. But this just means that, oh yeah, there's work that could be done. If you do a Control Shift L and like nothing changes, it's a bad image for this assignment. It's just not going to look, good in the end. So let's talk real quick about what the curve settings are, because what was it that I was doing over here? What were all those buttons doing? What's happening? Well, I'll do that in the next video. So just a quick reminder, curves is just a way to remap the original luminosity values to a different luminosity value. We can also do that on the RGB to do color correction, hence why I was able to go in and pop into just one channel like green and punch it up in some areas and not in other areas. In other words, curves is a way to target specific values regardless of their geographic location on the image. And this is incredibly powerful if you mix it with masks, because masks allow you to target things according to their geographic location, where they are. So combined, you can target the values regardless of where they are, and then block them in or block them out where they are with masks. And I'll show you all of this on this assignment over the next few videos. Next up, let's take a look at what all the settings are in here so that we can take the most advantage of curves, what all these doodads do, and how to handle them all. So I'll see you in a minute.